Right, welcome everybody to Manchester Trades Council's monthly council meeting. We always have a theme, and it's quite clunky tonight. The title is my fault, I came up with it. And we called it Rogue State, and we alluded to how the state and the authorities react to protests and to organised labour. And we decided this weeks and weeks ago, but obviously, the events of the last week just seem to have made this so pertinent and so necessary. So we've seen in the last week demonstrations in London after the awful murder of Sara Everard being put down by the police. And gender shouldn't really matter, should it? But the sight of British policemen attacking female protesters just doesn't seem right. And we've also seen here in Manchester a very sensible, and I'm using that word deliberately, spaced out professional people who work for the NHS having an anti-NHS or against the pay rise that's been put onto the NHS demonstration. One woman being arrested and another, who is one of our speakers tonight, Karen Reissmann, being given a £10,000 fine. Absolutely draconian. And then, of course, we've had the policing bill last night, which went through its second reading in the House of Commons. It's not over yet. There will be other stages to that bill. And it did seem last night as though some Tory MPs were willing to, although they were going to vote with their own side last night, were willing to try and amend it later on. And as I've just said in another meeting, that did happen a couple of years back with the trade union bill. So we've got to look for that and keep lobbying and keep putting the pressure on. That's really, really important. So it seems as though this week that our right to protest and our right to take action to defend our terms and conditions and just our general lives is being eroded really seriously. This is nothing new, of course. And our first guest tonight is Terry Renshaw, who is one of the original Shrewsbury 24 pickets. And I don't want to steal his thunder by, saying all about that particular strike, but the 1972 building strike was groundbreaking. This was in a situation where a lot of builders were working in absolutely dreadful conditions, soaking wet without any proper, toilets to work in. There was the conditions were just shocking, and for the temerity to stand up for themselves, they were fitted up by the police, but not even on the day. So I'm sure Terry will tell you all about this. If you imagine, if you don't know much about that dispute, that there were clashes on the day and the police arrested people, you'd be wrong. It happened weeks later. And not only that, but during the trials of some of those pickets that followed, there was absolutely dirty tricks from the establishment with links to MI5 security services and national television involved. So I'm sure Terry is going to tell us all about that. And one of the reasons why he is here is that the case, after all those years, has finally gone to the Court of Appeal because of the diligence of some of the campaign team who've uncovered the evidence that has finally forced the authorities to do something about it. So without further ado, I'm really, really pleased to welcome Terry Renshaw, one of the pickets and from the Shrewsbury 24 campaign. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you very much, John. It's great to be here with you at Manchester Trades Council. It's such a fantastic trades council that is steeped in history, and it's good to be there. I've been at the mechanics no end of times over the years, and I've just lost track of the times I've been there. But you must have some foresight, John. I don't know how, but you must have some foresight to pick tonight's title of the Rogue States with what's going on in this last week here in Britain. I don't. You must have seen this in your crystal ball somewhere and picked it up. But it's good to talk about it. But yeah, go back to the 1972 dispute with the building workers. I don't want to go over the whole thing because I'm sure that lots of people will already be fully familiar with what went on, or at least some of what went on. But it was the first ever national building workers dispute. We went at the request of pickets from Oswestry, from North Wales. We went up to Oswestry Labour Club to meet them. and we went picketing on sites around the Shrewsbury area. It was supposedly a conspiracy, but let me tell everybody, we didn't know where we were going. That's how much of a conspiracy it was. We had no idea where we were going. We went to the first site off the A5, a site called the Kingswood site, where we were greeted by a site agent with a loaded shotgun. We quickly took the gun off him, and then we realized that we were surrounded by police. The police were everywhere. There was up to 80 police officers there. That gun was handed over to the police officers. And from that moment on, the police escorted us around Shrewsbury on the day. They took us to seven different sites, and they were with us all day. And what we've got to remember about this, it was a building workers' strike, which had been going on for, at that time, 12 weeks. And out of the 12 weeks of the dispute, the state, and I say that deliberately, the state picked on one day. That one day was September the 6th, 1972. And out of that one day, when we went to at least 7 sites on that day with police officers with us, they picked on one site, which was the site of Brookside in Telford. Just the one site they picked on to take to court. So they had 12 weeks, picked on one day. They had 7 sites, picked on one site. That site just so happens to be, very coincidentally, a site being run by Robert McAlpine. Now, there's a coincidence, isn't it? For anybody to conjure with, there is a coincidence. Robert McAlpine, the treasurer of the Tory party, his site was the one that was picked on. And that's the site they concentrated their efforts on. But on that day in question, the police were with us all day. They never took one name. They never turned us back from any sites. They never gave out one warning, one issue of caution. Nothing was said on the day. Quite the contrary. At the end of the day, Inspector Meredith from the West Mercia Police came to the coaches as we were about to leave, and he said, "You've had a good day's picketing, lads. I wish you all a safe journey home." Those were the parting words from the lead officer on the policing on that day. 5 months later, 5 months, that's when the police from West Mercia started knocking doors in North Wales. And it happened to be on February the 14th of 1973. Valentine's Day. What a day to pick to come knocking us up. They must have had some weird sense of humour. But they took in 32 pickets for questioning. Some went to Shrewsbury, some went to Holywell, some went to Flint, some went to Wrexham. They took them to different police stations for questioning. And then after the end of the question, everything went quiet again. And approximately 2 weeks later, charges started dropping through the letterbox of 24 pickets. 24 pickets were charged. And they were charged with conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy to intimidate men to abstain from their lawful business. Well, if you go to intimidate people to abstain from their lawful business, that is picketing. That's what you do. You go there to ask them to come out and join you. We were charged with a fray. Not one name taken, not one caution given on the day. We were charged with unlawful assembly. Nobody asked to move on. Nobody told if you don't move on, then action will be taken. Nothing like that happened. But those were the charges that were laid against us. That was February the 14th. We had those charges. The people came to arrest us, and then couple of weeks later, the charges came through. And then we all went in March of 1973 for committal hearings at Shrewsbury Crown Court. And we were committed as one group of 24. We were committed on those charges at Shrewsbury Crown Court. And believe me, when we went up there, each side of the street, from the bottom of the town in Shrewsbury, right the way up to the monument on the top of the hill in front of the law courts, the streets were lined 2 deep, both sides, with police officers. That was intimidating. That was intimidating to us. So the committal hearings were held, and then following the committal hearings, we had dates for trial. And that's when we realized they broke us up into 3 separate trials. They didn't try us as one. We were committed as one, but not tried as one. And we went into the 3 separate trials. The first trial was Warren and others versus the Crown. And as we know, Des Warren got 3 years jail. 3 years Des Warren got. And then Ricky Tomlinson had 2 years and Mackenzie Jones had 9 months. The second trial, which started in the January of 1974, was a trial called Murray and others versus the Crown. And in that second trial, 3 went to jail again. Arthur Murray, Michael Pearce, and Brian Williams all got 6-month sentences. Then came the third trial. And the third trial was Renshaw and others versus the Crown. And fortunately or unfortunately, whichever way you look at it, I wasn't at the start of the trial because I'd broken my leg skating at Queensferry Leisure Centre, going around, snapped my leg quite badly, and I was in hospital. But there was no sympathy from the judge. My barrister gave my apologies. I couldn't be there. I was in hospital with a severely broken leg. The words from the judge were, check with the hospital. If he's fit to travel, I want him here in the morning. And believe me, that's what they did. They took me from a hospital bed and took me up to Shrewsbury Crown Court for that trial to continue. And I had to have 3 court ushers moving me around because I was stuck in a parking hall chair with my leg elevated, but they made sure that I had to go to that trial. There lies the dilemma, because on my court sheet, on my charge sheet, the charges were affray, unlawful assembly, and I'd noticed on the charge sheet that they'd put the wrong date on it. They'd put a date of when I was in hospital during the picketing. I'd been in hospital having an operation at the time in HM Stanley Hospital in St. Asaph, and they'd put a wrong date on it. But on the day that I attended court, because I refused to plead guilty, another 2 charges, one of unlawful assembly, one of affray, were put on me again on the day of attending court. So when I got into the box to give my own evidence on my behalf, Maurice Drake, who was the Crown prosecution, he asked me about the picketing on the day and what was going on, and I'd been identified as being in different places. And I said to him, you must be mistaken, Mr. Drake. And he said, well, why is that? I said, well, the date on my charge sheet, I was in HM Stanley Hospital in St. Asaph, undergoing surgery. The judge looked at me over his half-trimmed glasses. I can still see him. I was a young lad of 25. I can see him looking at me now. And he said, why did you not tell your barrister this? And I said in that cheeky young lad voice, if I'd have told my barrister, he'd have told the Crown prosecution. And I think they'd have come to an agreement on it. And I said, I think even in the courts, you have a wording for it. You call it plea bargaining, don't you? And he had to instruct the jury to find me not guilty on the charges on the charge sheet. But then there was the other two charges which had been put on the day. So they were discussed, and what happened in the third trial, we all got suspended sentences. I had a suspended sentence of 4 months, suspended for 2 years. Then came the fight then, because we had comrades in prison and we wanted to get them out. The campaign set up at the time was the North Wales area campaign group. And we looked at getting the lads out. We campaigned for funding and that from different parts, and trades councils and union branches and that across the country funded us tremendously. At that time, the unions didn't fund us. And when I say the unions in their name, the membership were absolutely fantastic. And not one picket went short of money, not one picket was short of support in any way, shape or form. So that campaign went on. Ricky and Desi were still in prison. And now we have a Labour government in, because we're into 1974. After February 1974, we got a Labour government in. And if anybody remembers, back in 1974, we had an election in the February and we had an election again in the October. And that's when the Lib Lab Pact was formed in February 74. But Harold Wilson couldn't work with the Liberals on that. But they served longer periods of time in prison under a Labour government than what they did under the Tory government. And we've got to remember that. We mustn't forget these things. So they were in prison. They had an appeal in 1975, Ricky and Desi, and the appeal judge said no, find no reason to let them out, put them back in prison, and they went back into prison. In 2003, under the 30-year rule, we applied for the papers in respect of the trials. And that's when we realized that things were getting played dirty. Because in 2003, when we applied for the papers, we were told, and think about it now, 2003, who was in power? But we were told, you can't have the papers because it would be a threat to national security. And that order had been signed by David Blunkett. He was the Home Secretary. He'd signed that order. We couldn't have the papers. We managed to get, I remember seeing one paper at the time, because some were released and the important ones that we wanted were held back. But I remember one paper, it was a letter from a fellow by the name of Sir Michael Hanley. Now, Sir Michael Hanley, if you do your Google search on him, he was Director General of MI5 from 1970 to 1976. And his letter to Harold Wilson at the time was heavily redacted, but you could make out it was saying these men must be kept in prison because it's a threat to society. That's what Michael Hanley was saying to Harold Wilson. And Roy Jenkins, who was the Home Secretary for the Labour Party at that time, he upheld that and he kept them in prison. But you'd have to ask yourself, what were MI5 doing being involved in a building workers' dispute? So the campaign carried on. And then in 2006, we set up the Shrewsbury 24 campaign over in Liverpool. People from the Northwest, a couple from North Wales, we set up the Shrewsbury 24 campaign to get justice for the Shrewsbury 24. That campaign set off then to find and seek new evidence. We wanted to go down the judicial route, not confrontational, get new evidence if we could find it. And we were so fortunate in having a lady by the name of Eileen Turnbull, who I've become very good friends with since. Eileen Turnbull was a retired legal officer from the GMB, and she took on the job of research and secretary. And she went to every nook and cranny in this country to seek out new evidence. And she found it. She found different forms of evidence, but the best one she came across was at Wellington Police Station in Shropshire. And it was the West Mercia Police Archives, where she found a letter there from the Chief Constable of West Mercia at that time in 1973, stating that they had destroyed the original statements taken of everybody, because at the time of taking the original statements, they didn't know what they had to prove, and they didn't have any photographic evidence. So they destroyed all the original statements. And we all know that's a no-no. You can't destroy statements without sharing with the defence. But that's one item that went back to court. She also found in another part of the country, I think it could have been Warwick University, she found the film Red Under the Bed. Red Under the Bed was a film that was shown during the trial. And it was produced by Woodrow Wyatt with a question and answer session at the end of the film. And in that film, it showed the pickets. It showed us all coming out of the courts on the committal hearing day in March. And that was contrary to us having a fair trial at Shrewsbury. So those issues were given then to the CCRC. The CCRC had it from April 2012, and in 2017, they knocked us back and said it cannot go back to appeal because we don't think the evidence is good enough. That was a knockback for us. Believe me, it was a real knockback because we'd had a good solid kicking from that one. The campaign team quickly called all the pickets together, and our legal team, Bindmans, came down as well into North Wales, and we had a meeting, and the legal team were advising us that we should go for a judicial review of the CCRC's decision. The campaign team withdrew from the room and just left the pickets in to discuss it amongst themselves. Obviously, I sit on the campaign team, but I'm also a picket. So I was in that room and we discussed going to JR. At that stage, two pickets decided they were not going any further. They said it couldn't be won and they were pulling out. And they wanted their names withdrawn from any application. We urged them, we begged them not to do that. And we all agreed, apart from the two, that we would go forward in a JR. Two dropped out, so two names didn't go forward for that judicial review. That judicial review had to go, first of all, to what's called a permission stage hearing. And that permission stage hearing was heard in Birmingham courts by a Justice J. And Justice J listened to the case from our barrister. Unfortunately, the CCRC's barristers weren't there. They didn't bother turning up because they felt confident they were going to win. Danny Friedman put our case to Justice J. He was on his feet all of the day. And at the end of the day, Justice J, he said, I've watched this case with great interest and I've listened to everything that's been said today. And I'm going to refer this now for a full hearing at the Court of Appeal. We'd won that first round. That was uplifting again now, so we were back on par. We had a good uplift on that. Then in April 2019, we had a date for a hearing in the courts again in Birmingham. And this time it was before Lord Chief Justice Flo and Justice Susanna Carr, two justices sitting on the appeal. And we turned up at the courts in Birmingham, and then the two pickets who had not been interested turned up at that hearing. Even though they weren't named in the hearing, they turned up for it. And at that hearing, our barrister, Danny Friedman, again, put the case forward. He was on his feet for nearly 2 hours when the barrister for the CCRC got to his feet, and I'm going to cut a lot of stuff out. He got to his feet and he said, "We wish to withdraw the case. We wish to concede the case that the Shrewsbury 24 campaign team have put forward, but we would like it back for further consideration because they don't like losing." So Justice Flo said, "Well, I'm of a mind to give it back to you. I will pass it back to you, but it must be heard by a new commissioner and a new case officer." And he handed that back to them. They had it for 10 months. And they never come back. So we went down, myself, Eileen, Harry Chadwick, the campaign chairman, and Mark Turnbull, Eileen's husband. We went down and we doorstepped the CCRC at their offices in Birmingham. And we made the case officer that was looking at it come down and see us. And he came down and he said, "You will hear by the end of the week." And by the end of that week, they referred it back to the Court of Appeal. They didn't tell us first. The first we knew about it, we read it in the paper. That's how bad they were with that one. So they referred it back to the Court of Appeal, and that Court of Appeal was held, as everybody should be aware by now, this year, February, only a few weeks ago now, February the 3rd and 4th, it was heard in London. And again, Danny Friedman, our barrister, put our case forward. He was on his feet on the first day, all day putting the case forward. The other two pickets were represented by their own barrister, even though we said they could have come on board with us. They chose to get their own barrister, a fellow by the name of Piers Marquis. But that case was heard over the 2 days. And at the end of the 2 days, Justice Fulford, who was the lead judge, he said, "We will retire now to consider the verdict. We will tell you now it will be a deferred decision, and you will get that decision within 2 to 4 weeks." Well, tomorrow is 6 weeks. And I'm sorry to say, we still haven't had the decision. That decision has still not been given to us, even though tomorrow is 6 weeks since they heard it. And I can't see what the Court of Appeal can do when they've listened to destruction of evidence, because that actually happened. That was confirmed with a letter from a chief constable of the police force that did it. So they don't have a lot to consider on that. The film Red Under the Bed was shown on Anglia television. They know it was shown because they've got documentary evidence. It was shown. And you can't show films because it becomes sub judice while a trial is going on. So I don't know what they consider. I don't know at this stage what the appeal court judges are deliberating on, because it's quite clear the evidence is there. We were set up by the state. The film Red Under the Bed was when Eileen found that, there was with it a little handwritten note from Edward Heath, the Prime Minister of the day. And that little handwritten note said, I want to see more of this, because what people need to realise, and you've got the spy campaign coming on after, that Edward Heath set up the Special Demonstration Squad, the SDS. He set that up in the late 60s. And he also set up and commissioned the IRD within the Secret Service to make the kind of films that Woodrow Wyatt did. And they made that film deliberately to show people what communism was all about and what a great threat we were. We were referred to as an akin to the Kray twins. And they frightened people. They frightened people in that way against us. All we were building workers who'd gone out on a day to picket building sites that were still working, to encourage them to join us, because at that time, on average, one person every day was killed on a building site. Think of that. One person every day was killed on a building site. The people that should have been in the dock were the building employers, not the building workers. But that's what it was all about. It was about safety on the job and better pay and conditions. That's what we went out for, and that's what we demanded. And then when the campaign team set itself up, it was to get the case back to the Court of Appeal. Well, we won that case. We went back to the Court of Appeal. We just need that decision now from the Court of Appeal. And hopefully everybody will give us some, still need the support from everybody on this one. Give us that support, because we're living in dangerous times. And on that, obviously, there's going to be a Q&A after, I think. So if anybody wishes to ask any questions, John, I am here for the rest of this meeting with you to answer any questions. So thank you very much for the invite.
Thank you, Terry. It's been a privilege listening to you. I think some of us who think, we put ourselves on the line for the trade union movement, we hear guys like you and realise we're only about that far along in our own experiences. So thank you very much, and we will come back to you. We've talked about how last week there was a shocking police action in Manchester, where only around 40 people were demonstrating against the measly pay rise for the NHS. And the organiser of that demonstration was Karen Reissmann, who's here tonight. She's not going to give a full speech about it, but she's going to be here as an eyewitness account and let us know exactly what happened last week. As you probably know, she was issued with a £10,000 fine, which was just absolutely ridiculous, completely draconian. And basically, we just want to hear from Karen for about 5 minutes, if that's okay, Karen, and tell us exactly what happened, because I think a lot of people have heard maybe what was in the press, but they'd be really interested to hear what happened. So I'll hand over to Karen Reissmann.
Brilliant, thank you, John, and thank you everybody for all the support that I've had since I received that fine. It's quite frightening when you get a £10,000 fine, and to find that sort of people who I've never met or heard of in my life set up GoFundMe pages, which means that we raised within a few hours the money that I need, not just to pay the fine, but to go through the first stage of any legal challenge, is really, really heartening, and it is a sign of the extent of anger with the way the government are behaving. I was talking to somebody on the buses picket line, and he said he gave to it because he wanted, even though it had gone over the £10,000, because he wanted to make clear to the government that he doesn't agree with what's being done to people at the moment in terms of their protesting. And I think that's probably why the majority of people gave, in order to send a message to the government. And it is ironic, really, that that a protest where I was there, my union branch had organised a protest at very short notice, but felt that we had to mark the fact that there was such huge anger amongst health workers about the 1% pay offer, that we think will lead to a much loads and loads more health workers thinking there is no future in the health services if this is how you treat health workers, and people will vote with their feet. They're already voting with their feet, and are just not prepared to put up with the level of exhaustion and distress that it means working in the health service at the moment that isn't going to go away. So we called the demonstration. It couldn't have been safer. We did a full risk assessment. There is loads and loads of evidence. I can put it in the chat if you need to, about how it is virtually impossible to pass COVID on in the outside. Almost all the transmission takes place inside. Even the outside events like Cheltenham, the reason why they have passed it on is because of people travelling together in enclosed spaces or spending a lot of time in the bar in enclosed spaces, not the time that they spent outside. It is virtually impossible, really, really difficult. And we were 2 meters apart, we had masks on, it was very, very strictly stewarded. It wasn't about safety that they closed me down, and the police made that quite clear. They weren't interested in any of the safety that we'd made. They asked me what we were doing. I explained. They told me it was unlawful. I explained why I thought it wasn't dangerous or unsafe at all. These were COVID regulations. We were health workers. They weren't interested. They said they were going to talk to Silver Command. I said I would talk to the people on the demonstration and explain to them what was going on while they were talking to Silver Command. I did that. They then came back and said, you have to close the demonstration. If you don't, we'll fine you, we'll report you to your employer, and we'll report you to the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and you'll get potentially struck off. At which point we decided to close down the event. I made a speech explaining to what was going on and closed it down. Did a few TV interviews, people left the square, and then I was taken off to one corner and issued with a £10,000 fixed penalty notice for organising a gathering of more than 30 people. And I think there is something quite strange about how it's not unlawful to mismanage COVID so badly that we have the worst death rate in the world. It's not unlawful to give us PPE that's 6-7 years out of date with masks that don't fit. It's not unlawful to deny that it's airborne and therefore to insist that surgical masks are safe for working on a COVID ward, the paper blue ones, that they're safe when we know they're not. And that's why health workers are still catching COVID at work to this day, because we're not being given the right PPE. It's not unsafe to put a budget in that enriches the rich and impoverishes the poor. And I just think the level in which they use the state, given the amount of deliberate, constant balancing of, should we look after people's health or should we look to profits? And they have constantly not looked at people's health and looked at profits. And the resistance and the anger about that, they're desperate to suppress. And they use the state in order to do that. So you think of a £10,000 fine to a worker is a huge amount of money. If I used my 1% to pay off that fine, it would take me 56 years to pay that fine. If Dominic Cummings had received a fine, which he didn't, we know, but had he received a fine for behaving unlawfully, and he did put people at risk, then he would have taken him 3 months to pay his fine off. And that's the difference between what they do to us and what they do to them, that those are designed to stop people protesting. And I think essentially the only way that we will be able to sort of resist it is to carry on protesting. I think the fact that last weekend when Sara Everard died, and it's alleged that she was murdered by somebody who was a serving police officer in the Metropolitan Police, and people wanted not just to mark her death and to show their respects, but also to call for an end to violence against women that's endemic in the society that we live in. To find that broken up, both declared that well, the court case was actually quite ambiguous. It didn't say that it was illegal. It said that you had to negotiate with the police, and the police said there's nothing that we can agree that would be safe, which did actually undermine what they'd told the court. But nevertheless, that to then see police attack a demonstration using male violence against women who are protesting is just beyond ironic. But it is a desperate act on the part of a government that know that people are angry and they want to protest. And that's why I think it is crucial that we have to get together and oppose them. Because if we don't, then I think that government will carry on killing more of us and impoverishing more of us, which kills us as well. And I think we have to stand up and resist that. And that may well mean resisting the laws that they're bringing in the way that people have over the last couple of weeks that has shifted the government. So, you know, up until sort of, you know, a day or two ago, it was going to remain illegal or not allowed to protest right up until the end of COVID. Now they've said they will lift that on the 29th of March. And that's because of the people who went out and I suppose, defied the instructions that the police were saying, and shamed them into stopping what they were doing. And that's something we need to begin to organise more of, that resistance to stop it. You know, you look at Black Lives Matter. If people hadn't mobilised in their millions across the world, would anti-racism be at the level that it is today without it? And it wouldn't be. And I just think we have to say that protest is the way that we as workers collectively use our power in order to say what we want, because we know in Parliament half the time it feels like the opposition aren't opposing, and that makes it very difficult for people. I think we have to ultimately have that right to be able to organise for ourselves and to do that. I know there's a meeting planned on Monday in Manchester to try and coordinate some response to the crime and policing and sentencing bill, and I think it's important that we do coordinate the largest number of people. That bill's outrageous. Some of the stuff that it says about sort of gypsies, travellers and Roma is virtual extermination of that group, that whole community. And I just think it's outrageous how sort of, you know, the petty racisms, the petty scapegoating, where they want to blame individuals for things that are actually a product of the society that we live in, rather than changing the society that we live in, is at the...
Aaron, I do apologise, but if you could just start to wrap that up now. So
I will do. So, and I mean, I'd say sort of come to the meeting in Manchester that's on next Monday. I think there's a protest planned sort of, or being talked about, for Saturday the 27th, and I think we should try and see whether we can sort of, you know, mobilise people to come along to that, because I think unless we resist this, they are going to make it harder and harder for us to stand up for working class people's rights. Thank you for inviting me.
thank you very much, Karen. And obviously hope you can hang around for the Q&A that we're hoping to have. We've known about police infiltration of left-wing and progressive organisations for many years, of course, but it hit the headlines a couple of years ago when more revelations started leaking out about police officers abusing relationships with female members of these organisations. This led to, obviously, campaigns against that. Only yesterday in The Guardian, there was a big story about Kate Wilson, an environmental activist who was deceived into a 2-year relationship with a policeman. And in the court case that she's brought, she was told that the Met deputy was too busy for questions to appear in court. So on that note, I'd like to welcome Lindsey from Police, Spies, Out of Lives. Lindsey is part of that campaign, obviously. I've not had a chance to speak with her before the meeting tonight, but I believe she might want to stay anonymous. She will tell you that now, but I hope that's okay with everyone. So I'll hand over to Lindsey.
Hi, John. Thanks for that. And thanks for inviting me. I feel quite privileged to be on a platform like this, speaking after such amazing people. So yeah, I am retaining anonymity. I've got legal anonymity in the undercover policing inquiry, and I wish to retain that anonymity. And because the meeting's being recorded, that's why I just want to keep my screen off. I hope that's okay with everybody. Fine. So yeah, so I'm from Police, Spies, Out of Lives, which is a campaign and support group set up by 8 women who were the first to take legal action against the Metropolitan Police for their undercover officers forming long-term intimate sexual relationships with those 8 women. 8 was known about at the time, and the current tally is 54 women that we know of who've had relationships with undercover officers. And every new tranche of the undercover policing inquiry, we're getting more information about the scale of undercover relationships. So we all were involved with officers from 2 spying units, the Special Demonstration Squad, which Terry mentioned, which was set up in 1968 after the Vietnam War, anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, and the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. So the Special Demonstration Squad was a London-based unit. The National Public Order Intelligence Unit was a national unit, and infiltrated environmental, animal rights, political, trade union groups in the regions. That was set up in 1999. Neither of those units exist anymore, but their activities have been subsumed into Counter-Terrorism Command at the Metropolitan Police. So, you know, we doubt very much that the level of spying has decreased. It may have changed in form, but we don't believe it's decreased. The women who found out they'd been in relationships with these undercover officers, and I haven't got time to go, the story is massive. I haven't got time to go into the details, but they began to bring this level of abuse to public attention. I mean, you know, as political activists, as trade unionists, we've always known that there is some kind of state surveillance going on of political groupings. You know, we knew people had their photographs taken, we knew people had their phones tapped, but we didn't suspect that infiltrations as long as 7 years, which is the longest that we know of, from Mark Kennedy. John's just mentioned him in relationship to Kate Wilson. He had 11 relationships that we know of so far whilst he was undercover. We had no idea that level of surveillance would be funded, would be undertaken, even though we knew, you know, that political control is basically uppermost in the minds of sections of the state. I was involved with what was the militant tendency, became the Socialist Party back in the day, and we've actually people from the Socialist Party were actually refused core participant status, the undercover policing inquiry, and that is simply because they were spied on by MI5, pretty certainly. And MI5 are not being investigated by the undercover policing inquiry. They will be allowed to continue as they have done, and as you know, as they are undoubtedly are now, without any kind of scrutiny whatsoever. But you know, I'm still talking about officers from these two units. That's who we know most about. The level of abuse is huge that some of these officers were involved in. So they spied on trade unions, wholesale spying within the trade union movement. Officers took names of dead children, so children who often died in infancy. They took their identities. So, you know, if any campaigners became suspicious of them, if they dug a little deeper, they would find a birth certificate without any thought whatsoever for the families who had lost these children. And some of those families have now been brought into the undercover policing inquiry. You know, heartbreakingly, they have to rake over these terrible, you know, old wounds. We know of at least 26 family justice campaigns that these officers spied on. So these are families who've often lost people to police violence, or the police have messed up the investigation. And instead of the police pouring time, resources, money into finding murderers and wrongdoers within the police force itself, they turned their attention to the family justice campaigns themselves and spied and infiltrated those campaigns. And so it was the women who discovered they were in relationships, and a whistleblower called Peter Francis, who was an SDS officer, coming clean and basically saying he was tasked to not only infiltrate, but to smear the family of Stephen Lawrence during their campaign. So it was those two things that kind of forced Theresa May to announce the undercover police inquiry in 2014. So these officers were involved in the blacklisting of workers, the illegal blacklisting of workers. It's been found out that they actually did pass information to the blacklisting agencies. Miscarriages of justice, there's been over 50 convictions overturned as a result of these officers either breaching lawyer-client privilege or using their cover identities, lying to the courts, basically. So yeah, over 50 miscarriages of justice. And we know of 10 elected MPs so far who've been spied on and have their officers infiltrated by these officers. The more we find out, the more we realise MI5 are the taskmasters. So these officers were working for special branches, but they were the information, ultimately, the majority of it went to, it says on the report, box 500, which is basically MI5. Sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. There's just so much to say. So the list of abuses is long, basically, by these police officers. And the undercover policing inquiry, as I say, called in 2014, began in 2015. It only began to hear evidence in 2020. November 2020 was the first evidential hearing. It was supposed to report in 2018. The current report date is 2024, but some people in the know believe it'll be probably nearer to 2026 when the inquiry wraps up and reports. It's been called one of the most complex, expensive and delayed inquiries in British legal history. And this is mainly because officers applied wholesale pretty much for anonymity, and they are lobbying intensely to keep every bit of evidence from public view under the guise of national security. So, like Terry was saying, the police in our cases destroyed evidence after the public inquiry had instructed them to keep certain documents. Documents were destroyed. They got a slap on the wrist for that. Yeah, we're very unhappy with the public inquiry. As public inquiries do, they tend to kick these things into the long grass, and this is what's happening. But we're staying in there. We're very unhappy with the judge, who's come from the very secret investigatory powers tribunal. That's where Kate Wilson's case is at the moment, that John mentioned. We want to see our intelligence files. We want the inquiry extended to Scotland and Northern Ireland, because ridiculously, it's just England and Wales at the moment. We want live streaming of the inquiry. We had a stupid circumstance where, after 5.5 years of waiting for these evidential hearings to begin, we were able to see the evidential hearings on a rolling transcript. Unless you were prepared to break COVID regulations and go to a hotel in central London, you had to put up basically with a rolling transcript of the evidence. So Police Spies Out Alive's actually live streamed the readings of the evidence live on YouTube, and we got some pretty well-known actors to help us out with that. So we just thought that was 2 fingers up at the inquiry, really. And as a result of that, they're actually given us audio streaming this time round, and they're trialing this totally against the police's will. They're trialing audio streaming, but they totally refuse any kind of video stream. So very quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, 2 very important things just to touch on what Karen just said. Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill has been rushed at breakneck speed through Parliament. It's now an act. It became an act on the 1st of March, I think. That puts no limit whatsoever on what covert human intelligence sources, which is undercover agents and informers, it puts no limit at all on the type of crimes that these people can commit. So there were amendments to try to limit some of the crime, to try to list some of the crimes which were absolutely not legal: murder, torture, rape, etc. But that those amendments were voted down consistently, so there is no limit on the type of crime they can commit. There's no safeguard from the Human Rights Act. The government argued that the Human Rights Act would be a safeguard, but for me, I had a 1-year relationship with an undercover police officer, and that was after the Human Rights Act came into force. So that's a blag of an argument. The oversights for the authorisations are very weak with the CHIS bill. So it comes down to an officer basically thinking that the infiltration is proportionate and necessary, and that's good enough for the crime to be committed. And there's no redress, either civilly or legally. There's no redress for anyone who was abused under, by a CHIS under this legislation. Karen mentioned the police crime sentencing and court bill, which was debated. I think it had its second reading on Monday. In this, the government are talking about using drones. They're talking about rolling out en masse facial recognition technology at demonstrations, and there's more powers to refuse and to stop demonstration as well. So we can very clearly see what the agenda of this government is. Very much like the Thatcher government is to crack down on any kind of dissent. But as Karen said, what we must do is resist this. We're great in number. There are many of us. There are many protesters on all sides of, you know, from many different organisations, not just the trade union movement, but outside as well. So yeah, we have to use our collective might to resist these legislations because they're scary. And I don't want my son, you know, growing up in a country with this kind of legal, you know, legislation in place. So yeah, I'll leave it there. There's so much more to say. I hope it's made sense because it's very rushed. But yeah, feel free to ask questions for clarification.
Lindsey, thank you very much. It made perfect sense. And I'd just like to say as well, it just occurred to me, tonight is St. Patrick's Day. And anybody who knows about the history of the North of Ireland knows what terrible things the British state did there and continue to do. But there's almost that they don't do it over here. And anybody who sat here and listened to the speakers tonight will realise that we're fooling ourselves if we think that we get let off. Exactly the same ideas are being peddled over here as well.
One point I'd like to, well, it's not a point, and it's also a question to Terry. I've done a bit of reading up recently, or refreshing my memory about the campaign and about the issue of the Shrewsbury pickets, and I was just wondering. I noticed that part of the, you know, part of the kind of political background to all of this was a statement from the then Home Secretary Robert Carr about his intention to write to chief constables about the issue of picketing and their responsibilities. I was just wondering whether you feel that you know, the extent to which you feel that played a role in what you know, in what happened to you and your comrades. The other thing, you know, I mean, yet again, you know, we see with David Blunkett. I mean, it's you know, I think the Labour voted against. Again, I mean, I just feel that they were pushed into this. I mean, the extent to which Sir Keir Starmer, former head of the Crown Prosecution Service, who I believe played quite a role in stopping Cressida Dick from getting the stick that she deserved over the shooting of Charles de Menezes in London, in the London Tube. I mean, I think it just shows how we can't, you know, the Labour Party, particularly under its current sort of leadership and the type of leadership that it had in 2003, you know, they're not going to do anything unless they're pushed into it, unless they're pressurised into it, with one or two honourable exceptions. You know, clearly one of them being the one who used to be the leader until 2019. But yeah, Terry, if you'd like, you know, if I'm interested to hear what you've got to say about Robert Carr anyway.
Robert Carr, it's interesting, Evan, that Robert Carr is the only, what can I say, high political member of Parliament who's held a high role in office, who's never done any diaries. And we can't find any information on Robert Carr. We can't even find the letter that you refer to when he wrote to the chief constables. We know he did it because we found the replies, but we haven't found the letter that went out. And it's so strange, but it only goes to prove the political interference of the government on a trial. And that, if we look at our justice system and we think it's going to be any good, it's usually only good if there's no interference from outside bodies. There was definite political interference in the Shrewsbury case. And that came about because Robert McAlpine wrote to Robert Carr asking for action to be taken against the pickets because his company had to pay out big increases to their workers, and also had to start then implementing health and safety measures because in 1974, the Health and Safety at Work Act came into play, which made them make areas of work safer. So Robert Carr played a big game in that one, but there's no information we can find, and Eileen's looked everywhere. We can't find anything on Robert Carr. When we come to David Blunkett, he was the first Home Secretary to write an order to say that these papers must be kept away from public knowledge and public view. And when he wrote the order, it was kept away then. He signed the order in 2003. So the papers were then kept, in 2002. So the papers were then kept away for 10 years until 2012. Then in 2012, the Tory government then signed another order that the papers which would be kept for another 10 years till 2021, which is now, we're in 2021 now, but this is putting us nearly 50 years after the event. So we still haven't seen those papers, and I don't think we ever will see those papers. And I don't know what the governments are trying to protect in this, whether they're trying to protect a company or an individual. But most of the people that were involved at that time are now dead. Most of them will be dead, including Robert Carr, including the prosecution counsel, Maurice Drake. He's since passed on. They've all gone. The judges have gone, but they're still keeping papers back. And I think it's about compromising the courts at the time that they don't want to do it, because the courts, whatever is said and done, the courts must not be compromised. Whatever happens, we must not compromise the courts, because the courts are beyond that, or that's what they'd have us believe, isn't it? So we're still there, Evan, looking for this paperwork, trying to seek it out. We did have a promise from the Labour Party in the 2017 and the 2019 elections in their manifesto that if elected to office, they would release all papers in relation to historic cases, including the Shrewsbury 24 case. They would release those papers, but we're not going to see them. We had the debate in Parliament in January 2014. David Anderson, the MP at that time for Blaydon in the North East, put forward a backbench debate. And that backbench debate was heard for 3 hours. And at the end of 3 hours debate, they withdrew and they came back, and it was 123 for the release of the papers to 3 against. And even with that kind of a vote, the government would still not release the papers. So we're not going to see them, Evan. We're not going to see them at all. But we know MI5 were involved. We know the Special Demonstration Squad were involved. We know the IRD, which is the Internal Research Department, which Teddy set up, were involved in the making of the film Red Under the Bed. The MI5 and Metropolitan Police supplied information to Woodrow Wyatt and the team to make the film Red Under the Bed. They supplied all the information, which again should not happen, because we talk about information supposed to be protected. They were putting it out to these people to make television programs on it, to have a go at certain groups of people. And in our case, it was to have a go at communism, because communism is a swear word and it must not be used. And that's what happened. But with Robert Carr, he's the only one, Evan, interesting fact, never written a diary. Never written a diary.
Hi, everybody. I just want to make a point and a question for John Maloney, given his Assistant General Secretary from PCS. Hi there. The point within the remit of this meeting, but it might be a benefit of a second meeting altogether, is I don't know what book it was that I read in, that it was someone boasting, it might have been the intelligence services or the police, that if you've got any organisation that is the size of a football team, they will have somebody in it or an informer. So that's a question that the trade union movement doesn't address. Is I'm certain, we certainly saw it within the miners, that across all union national executive committees, particularly the more militant unions, there will be someone on there that is an informer or a police spy or what have you. And it can be just an ordinary, genuine trade union member that gets elected. And I think a lesson to factions is that dominate the committees, because you can't get on these committees unless you're as an independent in most unions, is factions should be very, very careful about people who they're letting onto that slate. So as I say, all national executive committees, I think, are infiltrated by the state. Would want to know who are the militants, who are the ones that are planning action, where we're strong, where we're weak, when the action's going to take, unofficial, official action, all that lot. So maybe a time for another, a subject for another day, but that's part of the rogue state as well. My question to John, PCS, is I'm a veteran protester, a lifelong trade unionist, and I also run the PCS Samba Band. We've been stood down for the last year now.
Dave, can I just stop you there, please? We're trying to get some questions and answers in before John comes on at the end to talk about PCS issues.
It was just a general point about just next week, the 27th of March, where the PCS is supporting demonstrations against the police crime bill. I'm saying we've been stood down for a year, but we see this issue is it's no coincidence that the Tories are debating restricting civil rights while the pandemic has restricted all our civil rights. What was the rush for this legislation? So it's just where the PCS is supporting what will be seen as unlawful protest, and the band is ready to participate on this one in Manchester on the 27th. Thank you.
So apologies for missing the first part of the meeting. I had other work meetings I had to attend. I think this is really important now. I've heard some people alluding to things which I may have missed, but a few years back, I was studying at uni, and I did it was a politics module on the British security state, surveillance and subversion, and it was a very interesting module. The people that formed MI5 and Special Branch and all these people, people connected to people like Winston Churchill and the Economic League, all these people were working together to break the general strike, to fend off what they saw as revolution and stuff like that. And there's no doubt that some of these links have continued. One of the other things that we touched upon in that course was the talk about a plot against Harold Wilson, and some of the people around the periphery of that were also had connections to the security state and stuff like that. So that this is a long-running theme, and the people at the top of business interests who have got personal financial interest, and as well as a kind of a class or a political interest in undermining the trade union movement and breaking the ability of unions to organise and to fight effectively against them. That's gone on historically. So I guess it's really important that we get involved in this. I am personally very disappointed that we've got position in the Labour Party now where, because of recent events, we've come out with the correct stand about the recent protests and the right to protest, but at the same time that's totally at odds with the waving through the previous bill on the police powers. It's totally contradictory, because the two things are intrinsically linked. The attempt to undermine protest is just the thin end of the wedge compared to all the spying and the infiltration, the kind of lawless activity that we've seen and that's been condoned basically by, sadly, the Labour Party has voted through no sort of legal restrictions on the operations of these people. It's really disgraceful. We've got to fight against it, and if we don't succeed in pushing back on this, then we will be living in a grimmer and more oppressive state. But I don't think we should be under any illusions that it's ever been any different. I think this battle has been ongoing, and we'll keep having to fight it, because the security state is there, and it was there in the miners' strikes people have mentioned. I don't think it's gone away. It might have receded, towards the end of the Cold War, but they've just found other things to get involved in, and like environmental campaigns have now had a lot of policing and infiltration and stuff, and been seen as a threat, along with things like anti-racism campaigns. People talked about Stephen Lawrence campaign and others. The reality is that bureaucracy finds things for itself to do. So the security apparatus, whenever one threat, so-called, whether it was real or imagined, has been neutralised or recedes, they find something else. There's always a new enemy, because they need a new enemy, because otherwise they're out of a job. Spies and people that surveil people need to have something to investigate, and they will find something.
Yeah, I've just got a question for Terry. To Terry, would it not be right to use the word conspiracy to describe what put you on trial? It's a question really of how do we understand the operation that went to such lengths to make sure that a group of building workers were picked up and made an example of, that it's not just about the injustices, it's about the political impact of trying to make sure that others don't follow your example. To Lindsey, my question is really, why have we got this new police courts crime sentencing courts bill? Surely the police have got enough powers already. Surely everything that your story tells shows that they have incredible power. Is it not really that they're actually trying to intimidate us with additional legislation about trying to stop people even going on demonstrations? The police don't need additional powers. They can pick anybody up on a demonstration at the moment. The question for us, I think, as a movement is, are we not back in a situation which we've been in before? There was, after all, just last 2 years ago, the 200th anniversary of the Peterloo massacre. That was a moment where clearly the state was determined to make an example of a rising movement. And are we not there now, with the time when the pandemic has created such a backlog of demands, as the injustices that have been magnified by what's happened are going to come out into the open?
I do want to give John Maloney, who's come here tonight, some time to speak. So I'd like to welcome John. He wasn't originally part of the theme, but we always welcome trade unionists of any ilk, any trade union, if we find they are available each month. And as I said before, I'm sure John will somehow find a way to slip into our theme tonight. So I'll hand over to John Maloney for a report on what's happening with PCS.
Thanks so much, and thank you for inviting me. I mean, I will come to the theme about protest, because it seems to me that's linked with the right to take strike action, which is more than protest. Obviously, it has a particular aim. It's to hurt the employer and to win. But nevertheless, it seems to me the right to protest, the right to strike are completely connected. If you diminish one, you diminish the other. And that's the problem in this country, is obviously we have diminishing rights, both to protest and strike action. And obviously, if this bill goes through completely, as is highly likely, we'll have even less rights to protest. Now, I'm not trying to hold up the past to say that somehow Britain, there was a golden age of protest, a golden age in the past where people could stand up and openly speak. As Terry has so magnificently pointed out, and obviously through not only his words, but his actions, and obviously all the other pickets, is the state in the past has attacked the trade union movement. As Lindsey indicated, it's attacked all types of dissident, be it political, ideological, geological, whatever dissidents. But the problem was, or the difference, I think, or the key difference is, in the 70s, there was a very powerful trade union movement, a labour movement. That was the background. Even in the 80s, there was a powerful trade union movement and labour movement. We have a less powerful trade union movement and labour movement now. And my argument to this meeting is that where you have powerful trade union movements and labour movements, you have a freer society. When they're weakened, you have a less free society. And I think the price, as we all know, for parliamentary democracy or any type of democracy is eternal vigilance. And in my opinion, we are facing a government that has authoritarian traits. I don't say that as a sort of like throwaway remark, because I do recognize in some countries in Europe, etc., about true authoritarianism, what it feels like when you see what's happening in Ukraine, Hungary, elsewhere, Poland. But nevertheless, it is our job as the Labour movement is to raise the cry, is that we have to defend parliamentary and other democratic rights. This government is openly talking about changing the franchise system of this country, taking out of the playbook of the Republicans in the United States. It wants to suppress the vote. So, for instance, they're talking about in a year or so time introducing a new franchise bill in which anybody who can't buy show by a passport or by a driver license or some other form of ID, photographic ID, won't have the right to vote. Now, my understanding is the initial analysis done of that restriction, it would knock 11 million people off the electoral roll. The people who would tend to have those IDs would tend to be richer, tend to be people in more settled backgrounds. In other words, the sort of people who probably be more likely to vote Conservative. So as you can see in some states in America, you can have the trappings of a parliamentary democracy, but actually the state, in that case, actively suppresses people's right to vote and makes it difficult to vote. And actually, clearly, the Republican Party doesn't want black people to vote. Well, in this country, the Conservatives, it seems to me, I've announced that in essence, they don't want black people to vote here because disproportionately, black people won't have those forms of idea, and poor people won't either. They're also looking to change some of the norms, or they've already started to undermine the norms of parliamentary democracies. Now, again, I'm not holding up some beacon that somehow in the past governments were infinitely better. They weren't. However, there were certain norms about accountability that this government is clearly contemptuous of. I was talking to John MacDonald, the MP, and obviously, hopefully everybody knows about John today. And he was telling me that even Conservative MPs are saying to him that they can't get the government to even talk to them. Now, obviously, I have very little sympathy in one sense, but there is an important parliamentary principle. If the House of Commons supposedly is the sovereign body of this country, and the government doesn't believe it's accountable in any way to that, so it won't share information, it won't have votes on things, then obviously our parliamentary democracy is undermined. This government has undertaken a review of the judicial law. I mean, Terry mentioned about judicial review. This government is openly talking about how it can restrict judicial reviews. And that could mean that in the future, the sort of judicial review that Terry mentioned that was so important for him might be banned. It might not be possible. Whatever we may think of the Human Rights Act, and obviously Lindsey has a particular critique of the Human Rights Act, the fact that if it was abolished tomorrow wouldn't be because we're going to have a dawn of freedom. It would be a sign of a more authoritarian approach, both for the police, but for the state. And this government openly talks about abolishing it and replacing it by what they call, inverted commas, an English Bill of Rights. It's quite interesting terminology. Obviously, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland don't apply for this, but their particular Tory notion of what are particular rights. And there won't be worker rights. There won't be the right to organise. And that brings me on to my main theme, which is around the right to protest and the right to strike. That's, for me, they're actually one and the same. I said strike action for me shouldn't be protest action, but strike action nevertheless is a form of protest. It's a form of workers withdrawing their labour. Now, I'm not trying to overplay my militant background. I've been a civil servant for 32 years, etc., and what have you. But when I first started as a trade unionist, you could walk off the job. And actually, the trade union was sufficiently powerful. There was no laws against it. And I was on several strikes where we gave no notice to the employer and walked off. Now, that seems like so weird these days. And if you said it to a young trade unionist, or even most trade unionists, even if they had actually lived through that period, it does seem weird. But that's the sort of freedom that I think was so important. And that's where, when it's taking the COVID, why it's so important, that type of freedom. We have had lots of problems. Now, given the nature of our work, we've managed to make sure that most people work from home and therefore be much more protected than people on the shop floor, in factories, in shops, etc. So I'm not trying to pretend that the work that the civil servants, PCS members done is somehow uniquely dangerous. But nevertheless, people who work in job centres, obviously at the height of the pandemic, if there were people coming in, claimants coming in, being forced to actually, even in the height of pandemic, which was the government's view, to come in to be physically talked to about why they weren't seeking work in the middle of pandemic, then clearly that is a super spreader event. We've had it in other areas. The court system has been open more or less continuously through the whole pandemic, and we've had COVID case after COVID case after COVID case. Now, like I said, I don't want to overemphasize the militancy of the forerunners of the PCS, the unions like the CPS and Society, etc. But I think probably in those circumstances, people would have walked out in many of the courts, many of the job centres, and certainly in Devlay Swansea, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. Instead, we've had to go through balloting people about strike action. So we balloted 12 courts. We won yes votes in 11, but because we didn't hit the threshold, then actually out of those 11 courts, only 2 managed to get over the 50%. But they all face the same COVID dangers. In Devlay Swansea, we just got over the 50% barrier. We got 50.3, 8 votes in it. That meant if 8 people hadn't voted for whatever reason, or 9 people, we would have lost, even though the strike vote, which was for all-out indefinite strike action, was 71% in favour. And that is the real restriction, along with the restriction to protest, that I think the labour movement has to start talking about and campaign against. I think the labour movement and trade union is so acclimatised to the anti-trade union laws that in one sense it's just a factor that you build in, but people don't question it anymore. There was a protest, as people know, when the introduction of the 50% barrier was introduced, which was Boris Johnson's idea. He took it from when he was mayor of London because of the problems he was having with the RMT, who would win strikes, sometimes less than 50%, but nevertheless, when they took action, they were all solid action. And he decided when he became an MP to make sure that that bill was introduced, and it was. He clearly has other views as to the trade union movement for even further restrictions, it seems to me. So I think what COVID has shown is, one, without the shackles of the trade union movement, I think workplaces would be much safer. And certainly employers would have been much more reluctant to force people back to work, would have been much more careful about people's health and safety, because they knew that people could walk off. Now, people have argued about Section 44, and we've tried to do it on a mass scale. But unfortunately, what we've discovered is people have, on the whole, have very little confidence of an individual right being acted collectively. Now, that might be a criticism of the PCS, and that can be a discussion, a critique of the PCS. But where we have had people taking Section 44 rights, we've had a very mixed picture. Many times people have actually just been put on zero pay, and in fact, the unions fighting loads of employment tribunals up and down the country about that. In other places, the employer backed down, but it wouldn't replace the notion of collective action. Now, coming back to Dave's question, Dave asked about the 27th of March protest. The NEC has actually discussed protests in the COVID period, and the NEC's majority position is that actually it won't support the demonstrations where there's no social distancing, and is actually has questioned even those sort of protests. That's the majority view on the NEC. There's an NEC next week, which I hope will discuss the protest movements, will protest about the 27th of March, and I hope that they could come up to a conclusion that we will physically join in. But the NEC decision, and obviously the NEC runs the union, and that's the way it should be. It shouldn't be people like me, even if I think I've got a better view than the NEC, saying I think the NEC is wrong. and I somehow want to undermine the NEC, but the NEC majority position is clear. At the moment, it's not to join in, certainly not anything to do with what they consider dangerous. I think they will review that position next week. I hope they do. And I hope that we can take part in the protest movement, because I think it's vitally important to take part in the protest movement. But that will be an NEC decision. So I just want to end up on what I think is the key thing about protests. Protest, strike action, any form where workers, ordinary people can band together, collectivize, and protect themselves. The law's important as well, but those collective solidarity, I think, is vitally important for freedom in this country, and in fact, any country in the world. And where the trade union movement is attacked, in my opinion, is always, and I think empirically can be shown, is where democracy is weaker or is on the decline. And I think our role in trade union meetings like this, but obviously across the wider trade union movement and the Labour Party and all the Labour movement more generally, is one, to make the arguments about the right to protest, to say what we don't need is laws restricting, we need more laws to actually open things up. We actually genuinely need a right to strike in this country. As people, I'm sure everybody knows here, there is no right to strike in this country. There's an immunity from, in certain circumstances, from the consequences of strike, but we need positive rights. And one of the good things of the Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party was that they, for the first time, for a long time, the Labour Party started to address that defect in the law. And so the Labour Party had a notion that there should be positive right for trade unions. I think we must argue for that. And obviously this meeting we're having is part and parcel of that. And obviously I think over the period ahead, that's what we must campaign. And I'll finish on this. So when the Tories say more restrictions, we should say actually positive rights for trade unions, positive rights to take protest action wherever you want, and for actually the trade union movement to actually build its strength up again and start putting its weight on the scales of society to start moving this country back towards something that's more democratic. Again, I'm not holding up any sort of praise for the past, but I think we can all see the dangers ahead of us, and the trade union movement is going to be vital to actually avoid those dangers and actually to confront the real forces, I think, in the Tory party and elsewhere, which would restrict our freedoms and would actually put us towards a much more authoritarian country than we are presently. Thank you.
John, thank you very, very much. I'd like to thank all our speakers, Terry, Karen, Lindsey. We've heard of historical incidents which are still resonating today, and we need to win those battles before we can move on. And of course, new challenges with the new policing bill. And I think the lesson here is, as progressives, as trade unionists, we need to fight for those freedoms and for the ability to defend ourselves.